The autumn morning mist clung to the grounds of Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at the tall windows of the private apartments, watching the early joggers make their way along the long walk. Her fingers traced the condensation on the glass, while her mind wandered to the conversation she'd had with William the night before. Change was coming to the royal family, and with it, responsibilities that would reshape not just their lives, but the very foundation of the monarchy itself. William entered the room quietly, carrying 2 steaming cups of tea. Even after all these years of marriage, Catherine still felt that familiar flutter when he appeared unexpectedly. His hair was slightly disheveled from sleep, and he wore the casual clothes he preferred when they had no official engagements, a simple sweater and comfortable trousers that made him look more like any other father getting ready for a weekend with his children. "Still thinking about what grandfather said?" William asked, settling beside her on the window seat that had become their favorite spot for morning conversations. The cushions were worn from years of use, a small rebellion against the formality that surrounded much of their lives. Catherine accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic mug. "It's not every day one receives a call that changes everything," she replied, her voice soft but tinged with the weight of what lay ahead. King Charles had indeed called them both the previous evening, his voice carrying an unusual mixture of excitement and solemnity as he explained the decision that had been months in the making. The new titles they were to receive weren't merely ceremonial. They represented a fundamental shift in how the monarchy would operate, moving away from the distant, formal institution of previous generations toward something more accessible, more connected to the people they served. Charles had been planning this transformation since before his coronation, but it had taken time to work through the constitutional implications and gain the necessary approvals from Parliament and the Commonwealth realms. William set down his cup and turned to face Catherine fully. "Are you ready for this?" "Really ready? Because once we accept these titles, there's no going back to the way things were." Catherine had been asking herself the same question since the call ended. The titles would grant them unprecedented authority within the royal family structure, allowing them to make decisions about charitable initiatives, diplomatic outreach, and public engagement without the layers of approval that had traditionally been required. It was both liberating and terrifying. "I think about the children," she said finally. "George, Charlotte, and Louis. How will this affect them? We've worked so hard to give them as normal a childhood as possible, and now they'll see their parents taking on roles that will shape the monarchy they'll inherit," William finished. "But isn't that what we want? For them to see us actively working to make it better, more relevant, more connected to real people's lives?" The conversation was interrupted by the sound of running footsteps in the hallway outside their door. Louis, their youngest, burst into the room wearing mismatched pajamas and a grin that could light up the entire castle. At 5 years old, he remained blissfully unaware of the weight of royal protocol, treating the historic residence as simply home. "Mama, Papa, can we have pancakes for breakfast?" he asked, climbing onto William's lap with the casual affection that had taken the royal staff some time to adjust to. Previous generations of royal children had been taught to maintain formal distance even within the family, but William and Catherine had been determined to raise their children differently. "Pancakes sound perfect," Catherine said, reaching over to ruffle Louis's hair. "But first, let's get you properly dressed. I think Charlotte and George are already up." As Louis scampered away to find his siblings, William and Catherine exchanged a look that spoke volumes. They had built something precious here, a family that felt genuine and warm despite the extraordinary circumstances of their lives. The new titles would bring new challenges, but they would also provide opportunities to extend that same warmth and authenticity to their public roles. "The Commonwealth Tour," William said, referring to one of their first major initiatives under the new titles. 37 countries in 18 months. "We'll be away from home more than ever before." Catherine nodded. The tour had been Charles's suggestion, a way to demonstrate the monarchy's renewed commitment to the Commonwealth nations and to show that the new generation of royals understood the importance of personal connection over ceremonial distance. They would visit schools, hospitals, community centers, and local businesses, engaging with people from all walks of life in a way that previous royal tours had rarely attempted. "But we'll be doing it together," Catherine pointed out, "and we'll be able to make real decisions about how to help, not just offer sympathy and move on to the next engagement." The authority that came with their new titles would allow them to commit royal resources to specific causes on the spot, to make promises about ongoing support that wouldn't require months of bureaucratic approval. It was a level of autonomy that no royal couple had enjoyed in living memory. The morning progressed with the usual controlled chaos of family life. George, now 11, was deep into a phase where everything related to football consumed his attention. He peppered William with questions about whether they'd be able to attend matches while on tour, and whether he'd be able to practice with local teams in the countries they visited. Charlotte, 9 and fiercely intelligent, had already begun researching the countries they'd be visiting, creating detailed notebooks about local customs and languages. "Did you know that in Vanuatu they have a sport called cricket tennis?" she announced over breakfast, consulting her latest research. "It's like cricket but with a tennis ball, and everyone can play regardless of age or skill level." "That sounds like something we should try," William said, earning an excited response from all 3 children. This was exactly the kind of engagement that the new titles would make possible, not just observing local customs, but participating in them, creating genuine connections rather than polite distance. After breakfast, while the children were occupied with their various activities, William and Catherine retreated to William's study to review the briefing documents that had arrived that morning. The room was lined with books, many of them related to conservation and environmental issues that had become William's passionate focus. Photos of the family mixed with images from their various charitable initiatives, creating a space that felt both official and deeply personal. The documents outlined the scope of their new authority in detail. They would have the power to establish new charitable foundations without seeking prior approval, to enter into partnerships with international organizations, and to make commitments on behalf of the Crown that would be immediately binding. It was a level of trust and responsibility that reflected Charles's confidence in their judgment, and his recognition that the monarchy needed to evolve to remain relevant. "Look at this," Catherine said, pointing to a section about educational initiatives. "We could establish scholarship programs in every country we visit, not just symbolic gestures, but real, ongoing support for students who need it." William leaned over to read the passage she'd highlighted. The financial resources available to them under the new titles were substantial, drawn from Crown estate revenues and supplemented by parliamentary allocations. More importantly, they would have access to a network of royal connections that could amplify their efforts exponentially. "And this part about healthcare," William added, finding his own section of interest. "We could fund mobile medical units, training programs for local healthcare workers, mental health initiatives." The possibilities were exciting and overwhelming in equal measure. For years, they had felt constrained by the traditional boundaries of royal engagement, able to raise awareness and provide moral support, but limited in their ability to create lasting change. These new titles would remove many of those constraints. A knock at the study door interrupted their planning. Catherine's private secretary, Sarah, entered with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but we've had several calls from the media. There are rumors circulating about the announcement." Catherine and William exchanged glances. They had hoped to have more time to prepare before the news became public, but in the digital age, secrets were increasingly difficult to keep. Someone, somewhere, had leaked information about the upcoming changes. "What kind of rumors?" William asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The usual speculation about new titles and expanded roles, but also questions about what this means for the line of succession, whether there are tensions within the family, that sort of thing." It was exactly what they had expected but hoped to avoid. Any change within the royal family was immediately scrutinized for signs of conflict or constitutional crisis. The media would be particularly interested in how the older generation, especially Princess Anne and Prince Edward, felt about the younger couple receiving such significant new authority. "We'll need to accelerate the timeline for the announcement," Catherine said. "Better to control the narrative from the beginning than to let speculation run wild." William nodded in agreement. "I'll call grandfather and suggest we move the official announcement to Monday instead of waiting until the end of the week." As Sarah left to begin coordinating the accelerated timeline, Catherine found herself thinking again about the broader implications of what they were undertaking. The monarchy had survived for over 1,000 years by adapting to changing circumstances, but each adaptation carried risks. What if their new approach alienated traditional supporters? What if other Commonwealth realms saw their expanded authority as overreach? What if they simply weren't ready for the responsibility? Second thoughts? William asked, reading her expression with the intuition that came from years of partnership. Not second thoughts, Catherine replied slowly, but an appreciation of how much we're asking people to trust us, the public, the other realms, even our own family. We're essentially saying that we can do this better than it's been done before. William was quiet for a moment, considering her words. Maybe it's not about doing it better, he said finally. Maybe it's about doing it differently, in a way that fits the world we live in now rather than the world of 50 or 100 years ago. The distinction was important. They weren't trying to revolution the monarchy, but to evolve it. The new titles would allow them to be more responsive, more immediate in their ability to help and support, but the fundamental principles of service and duty would remain unchanged. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of phone calls and planning sessions. Charles was indeed amenable to moving up the announcement, and the various private secretaries began coordinating with Buckingham Palace to ensure that all the necessary protocols were followed. The Prime Minister's office needed to be briefed, as did the Governors General of the Commonwealth realms. The Archbishop of Canterbury would need to be consulted about any ceremonial aspects of assuming the new titles. As the logistical machinery of the monarchy swung into action around them, William and Catherine found a few quiet moments together in the garden. The autumn air was crisp, and the leaves on the ancient oak trees were beginning to turn gold and amber. It was here, in these gardens, that they had played with their children, hosted informal gatherings for friends and family, and found moments of peace amid the demands of royal life. "Do you remember when we first moved here?" Catherine asked, taking William's hand as they walked along a path they had traveled countless times before. "I remember thinking it felt impossibly formal," William replied with a laugh. "All those portraits staring down at us, the staff calling me Your Royal Highness at breakfast. And now? Now it feels like home. Real home, not just the place where we happen to live." That transformation, Catherine realized, was exactly what they hoped to achieve on a larger scale with their new roles. The monarchy needed to feel less like an institution and more like a group of people genuinely committed to serving others. The formal distance that had once been seen as necessary for maintaining royal mystique was increasingly viewed as outdated in an age of social media and immediate communication. The afternoon brought a family lunch where they made the decision to tell the children about the upcoming changes. George and Charlotte were old enough to understand the basic concept, though the full implications would likely only become clear over time. Louis, predictably, was more interested in whether the new titles meant they would have different crowns. "Will people call you different names?" Charlotte asked with the directness that Catherine both loved and occasionally found challenging. "Yes, we'll have new titles," William explained. "But we'll still be Mama and Papa to you, and we'll still be the same people." "Will you be busier?" George wanted to know. At 11, he was beginning to understand that his parents' work often took them away from home. "We might travel a bit more," Catherine said carefully, "but we'll make sure that doesn't change what's important. Family dinner, bedtime stories, weekend adventures, all of that stays the same." The conversation continued through lunch, with the children asking questions that ranged from practical to philosophical. Charlotte wanted to know if they would still live at Windsor, while Louis was concerned about whether their dog Orla would be affected by the changes. George, with the seriousness that sometimes surprised them with its maturity, asked whether the new titles meant they would be able to help more people. "That's exactly what it means," William told him. "We'll have more ways to help, more resources to make a difference." "That sounds good," George said simply, and Catherine felt a rush of pride at her eldest son's instinctive understanding of service. As the day drew to a close and the children settled into their evening routines, Catherine found herself back at the window where the day had begun. The early morning joggers had been replaced by evening dog walkers, and the light had shifted from the pale gold of autumn morning to the deeper amber of approaching dusk. William joined her again, as she had hoped he would. It had become their ritual over the years, these bookend moments of quiet conversation that helped them process whatever the day had brought. "Are you glad we said yes?" he asked. Catherine considered the question seriously. The day had been filled with logistics and planning, with phone calls and briefings and the machinery of constitutional change. But underneath it all, she felt a sense of rightness about the direction they were heading. "I'm glad we're doing it together," she said finally. I'm glad Charles trusts us enough to take this step. And I'm glad our children will grow up seeing that service isn't just about ceremony and tradition, but about finding new ways to make a real difference. William smiled, the expression carrying both affection and shared purpose. Tomorrow, the world changes a little bit. Tomorrow, we start trying to change it for the better, Catherine corrected gently. Outside their window, the lights of Windsor Great Park began to twinkle in the gathering darkness. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear the faint sound of music from the local pub and the occasional car traveling along the road that connected their historic home to the modern world beyond its gates. The new titles would bring new challenges, new scrutiny, and new responsibilities that neither of them could fully anticipate. But they would also bring new opportunities to bridge the gap between tradition and progress, to show that the monarchy could be both historic and relevant, both respectful of the past and responsive to the present. As they prepared for bed that night, Catherine found herself thinking about the children again. George, Charlotte, and Louis would grow up in a monarchy that was different from the one William had inherited, shaped by the changes their parents were about to embark upon. It was a responsibility that felt both thrilling and sobering. "Whatever happens," she said to William as they turned off the lights, "we'll face it together." Together, William agreed, and in that simple word Catherine heard all the love, commitment, and shared purpose that had brought them to this moment. The whispers had begun, and soon they would become a roar of change that would echo through the halls of every royal residence and the pages of history books yet to be written. But for tonight, they were simply a husband and wife, parents to 3 remarkable children, preparing to step into a future they would help create. The morning of the official announcement dawned gray and drizzly, typical November weather that seemed to mirror the nervous energy crackling through Buckingham Palace. Catherine stood in the yellow drawing room, adjusting the simple navy dress she had chosen for the occasion. The room, with its ornate gilded furniture and priceless paintings, felt simultaneously familiar and foreign as she prepared to step into her new role. William paced near the tall windows, occasionally glancing at his watch. In less than an hour, they would face the media for the first time as holders of their new titles, Duke and Duchess of Cornwall and Cambridge, with additional responsibilities as senior Commonwealth representatives. The titles themselves were less important than what they represented, a fundamental restructuring of how the royal family would operate in the 21st century. "The children are watching from the nursery upstairs," Catherine mentioned, trying to inject some lightness into the atmosphere. "Charlotte has prepared a list of questions she wants to ask the reporters." William's laugh was slightly strained. "I hope you told her she'll have to wait for the press conference to end before conducting her own interviews." The past week had been a whirlwind of preparation. Constitutional experts had been consulted, parliamentary procedures had been followed, and lengthy discussions had taken place with representatives from each of the Commonwealth realms. The changes they were announcing would affect not just the United Kingdom, but potentially all 36 Commonwealth nations, each of which had its own relationship with the Crown. King Charles entered the room with his characteristic brisk efficiency, followed closely by his private secretary and the palace press secretary. At 75, he moved with the energy of someone much younger, his enthusiasm for the changes they were announcing evident in his bearing. "Ready?" he asked simply, though his eyes conveyed both pride and a hint of nervousness that Catherine found reassuring. Even after decades of public appearances, the most significant announcements still carried weight. "As ready as one can be for turning the monarchy upside down," William replied, earning a smile from his father. "Not upside down," Charles corrected gently. "Right side up, the way it should have been all along." The press secretary, Helen Morrison, cleared her throat. "Your Majesties, we have representatives from 43 news organizations present, including correspondents from major outlets in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and other Commonwealth realms. The live broadcast will reach an estimated global audience of 200 million. The numbers were staggering, but Catherine had learned over the years not to dwell on the size of the audience. Instead, she focused on the message they wanted to convey, that the monarchy was evolving, becoming more responsive, and more directly engaged with the challenges facing the Commonwealth and the world. They made their way through the palace corridors toward the throne room, which had been set up for the announcement. The route was familiar, lined with portraits of monarchs and royal family members spanning centuries. Catherine found herself wondering what those previous generations would think of the changes being announced today. Queen Victoria would have been appalled, William said quietly, apparently following her thoughts. All that expansion of the empire, only to have her great-great-great-grandson give so much authority to people who weren't even born royal. Queen Victoria adapted when she needed to, Charles interjected from ahead of them. The monarchy that emerged from her reign was very different from the one she inherited. She understood that survival required evolution. The throne room buzzed with controlled activity as final preparations were made. Cameras were positioned to capture multiple angles, lighting had been adjusted to accommodate both broadcast and print media, and seating had been arranged to ensure that representatives from Commonwealth nations had prominent positions. Catherine took her place beside William at the podium that had been positioned in front of the throne. The symbolism was deliberate. They were speaking from a position of authority, but also accessibility. The throne remained in the background, a reminder of tradition, while they stood forward, representing the future. The questions began almost immediately after Charles concluded his opening remarks about the monarchy's continued commitment to service and adaptation. The first reporter, from the BBC, asked directly about the scope of their new authority. Your Royal Highness, can you explain what practical changes these new titles will bring to your role? She asked, directing the question to William. William stepped closer to the microphone, his voice steady and clear. The most significant change is our ability to make immediate commitments on behalf of the Crown when we encounter situations where we can help. Previously, most initiatives required extensive consultation and approval processes. While we will still coordinate with government and other institutions, we now have the authority to deploy royal resources and establish programs without delay. A reporter from The Times followed up. Can you give us a specific example of how this might work in practice? Catherine took this question. If we visit a community that has been affected by natural disaster, we can immediately establish a relief fund, commit to rebuilding assistance, and coordinate with local organizations without waiting for approval from London. If we encounter educational needs during our travels, we can establish scholarship programs on the spot. The goal is to make our service more responsive and more effective. Your Royal Highness, called out a correspondent from the Sydney Morning Herald. How do you respond to critics who say this represents an unprecedented concentration of power in two individuals who were not elected? It was the question they had been expecting, and William handled it with the diplomatic skill he had developed over years of public service. Our authority comes from the same source as all royal authority, ultimately from the consent of the people we serve, as expressed through their elected governments. These changes were approved by Parliament and by the governments of the Commonwealth realms. More importantly, this authority comes with corresponding accountability. We will be required to report annually on how we use these powers, and the resources we deploy will be subject to the same oversight as other Crown activities. The questions continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from constitutional implications to the practical details of their upcoming Commonwealth tour. Catherine found herself impressed by the quality of the inquiries. The reporters had clearly done their homework, understanding both the historical significance and the contemporary relevance of what was being announced. Duchess Catherine, said a reporter from Global News Canada, you've been a member of the royal family for over a decade now. How do you feel about taking on this expanded role? Catherine paused before answering, aware that her response would be analyzed and quoted extensively. When I married William, I understood that I was committing to a life of service. What we're announcing today doesn't change that fundamental commitment. It enhances our ability to fulfill it. I'm excited about the opportunity to make a more direct difference in people's lives, and I'm honored that we've been entrusted with this responsibility. What about your children? Asked a correspondent from The Guardian. How will these changes affect them? Our children will continue to be our first priority, William replied firmly. One of the advantages of our new structure is that we can be more efficient in our work, allowing us to maintain the family time that's so important to us. They'll also have the opportunity to see service in action as they grow older, which I think will prepare them well for their own future roles. As the formal press conference concluded, Catherine felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. The announcement had gone smoothly, but she knew that the real test would come in the implementation. The media attention over the next few days would be intense, with every aspect of their new roles scrutinized and analyzed. Charles approached them as the cameras were being shut down and the reporters filed out. "Well done, both of you. Clear, confident, and appropriately ambitious without being grandiose." "Now comes the hard part," Catherine replied with a slight smile. "Actually living up to what we just promised." The afternoon was spent in meetings with various palace officials, working through the practical details of their expanded responsibilities. They would have a larger staff, increased security arrangements, and access to resources that had previously been reserved for the monarch alone. More importantly, they would have direct communication channels with government ministers, Commonwealth representatives, and international organizations. "The Prime Minister wants to meet with you both next week," Helen Morrison informed them during one of these sessions. "She's particularly interested in how your new role might support the government's foreign policy objectives." Catherine nodded, making a note in her ever-present notebook. The relationship between the royal family and the elected government had always been delicate, requiring careful coordination to ensure that royal activities supported rather than complicated official policy. Their expanded authority would make this balance even more critical. "What about the other family members?" William asked. "How are they handling the changes?" Charles looked thoughtful. "Anne is, as always, pragmatic. She sees the value in making the monarchy more effective and has offered to help with the transition. Edward has some concerns about precedent, but he's supportive overall. The most important thing is that everyone understands this isn't about diminishing anyone else's role. It's about enhancing the monarchy's overall impact." That evening, after the children were in bed, Catherine and William found themselves in the small sitting room they had come to prefer over the more formal spaces in their Windsor apartments. The television was turned to BBC News, where their announcement was the lead story, followed by analysis from royal correspondents and constitutional experts. "Listen to this," William said, turning up the volume as a historian from Cambridge University offered his perspective. "What we're seeing is perhaps the most significant evolution in royal authority since the constitutional settlement of the early 20th century, the expert was saying. The creation of senior Commonwealth representatives with immediate executive authority represents a return to a more active royal role, but adapted for contemporary global challenges." Catherine found the analysis fascinating, but also somewhat surreal. They were watching strangers discuss their lives and their future with the same analytical distance typically reserved for historical figures. It was a reminder of how their personal decisions had become matters of public interest and constitutional significance. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" she asked William during a commercial break. William considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked him something important. "I think we're doing the necessary thing. The monarchy has to be relevant to survive, and relevance means being able to respond to contemporary challenges in meaningful ways. Whether we're the right people to lead that evolution, I suppose we'll find out." The next morning brought a stack of newspapers, each with their own take on the announcement. The coverage was generally positive, though there were the expected concerns about constitutional precedent and questions about oversight. One tabloid had managed to dig up photos of Catherine and William from their university days, running them alongside current official portraits under the headline, "From Students to Sovereigns." "I look so young in that picture," Catherine observed, studying a photo from their graduation ceremony at St. Andrews. "We were young," William replied. "Young enough to think that love would be enough to navigate all of this." "Wasn't it?" Catherine asked with a smile. William pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Love was the foundation. Everything else we've had to learn as we went along." The learning curve was about to become much steeper. Their first official duty under their new titles would be a visit to Scotland the following week, where they would announce a major new initiative for rural economic development. It would be their first opportunity to demonstrate the immediate decisive action that their expanded authority was supposed to enable. Catherine spent the morning reviewing briefing materials about rural Scottish communities, agricultural challenges, and economic development strategies. The depth of preparation required was overwhelming, but also exciting. For the first time, she would be able to make commitments that could create lasting change rather than simply offering moral support and hoping that others would take action. "We'll be establishing 3 pilot programs," she explained to William over lunch. One focused on agricultural innovation, one on rural broadband infrastructure, and one on sustainable tourism. Each program will have dedicated funding and staff and will be able to track progress directly. How much are we talking about in terms of financial commitment? William asked. Initial funding of £20 million, with provisions for expansion if the pilots are successful. But more importantly, we'll be leveraging royal connections to bring in additional partners, technology companies for the broadband initiative, agricultural universities for the farming programs, tourism boards for the sustainable travel component. The scope was ambitious, perhaps more ambitious than anything they had attempted before. But that was precisely the point of their new titles. To be able to think and act on a larger scale, to use the unique position and resources of the monarchy to tackle challenges that required sustained, coordinated effort. Their conversation was interrupted by a call from Kensington Palace. Princess Anne was on the line, wanting to discuss coordination between her existing charitable activities and their new initiatives. Catherine had always admired Anne's no-nonsense approach to royal duty, and her support for their expanded role was both welcome and valuable. "I've been doing this for 50 years, Anne said without preamble when Catherine took the call. "What you're proposing makes sense, but you'll need to be prepared for criticism when things don't go perfectly. And they won't go perfectly, they never do." "What advice do you have?" Catherine asked, settling in for what she suspected would be a lengthy conversation. "Don't promise what you can't deliver. But don't be afraid to promise big when you know you can follow through. The public will forgive failures of ambition more readily than they'll forgive failures of effort. And remember that this is a marathon, not a sprint. Pace yourselves." The advice proved prescient when, later that afternoon, they received word that their Scottish visit had attracted international attention. Media outlets from across the Commonwealth were requesting access, and the Scottish government was asking whether they could expand the program launch to include additional announcements. "This is exactly what we were hoping for," William said as they reviewed the requests. "The ability to create momentum, to use one initiative to enable others." Catherine agreed, but she also felt the weight of expectations settling on her shoulders. Success would validate their approach and potentially inspire similar evolution in other constitutional monarchies around the world. Failure, on the other hand, could set back the cause of royal relevance by decades. As the day drew to a close, Catherine found herself thinking about the children again. George had asked that morning whether their new titles meant they were more important than before. It was a question that went to the heart of what they were trying to achieve, not greater importance, but greater effectiveness in service. "We're the same people we were yesterday," she had told him, "but now we have better tools to help people." It was a simple explanation for a complex constitutional change, but it captured the essence of what they hoped to accomplish. The monarchy's authority had always been based on service rather than power in the traditional sense. What they were doing was finding new ways to make that service more direct, more immediate, and more effective. That night, as Windsor Castle settled into its evening quiet, Catherine stood once more at their bedroom window, looking out over the grounds that had become so familiar. Tomorrow they would begin the practical work of implementing their new role, but tonight she allowed herself a moment to reflect on how far they had traveled from that first meeting at St. Andrew's University. The young woman who had fallen in love with a prince could never have imagined the path that lay ahead, the responsibilities, the scrutiny, the weight of public expectation. None of it had been part of her original plans, but she had discovered along the way that the most meaningful journeys were often the ones you never could have planned for. William joined her at the window, slipping his arms around her waist in the easy intimacy of long marriage. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. Catherine leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "Ask me in 20 years, she said with a smile. "After we've had time to see whether this grand experiment actually works." "Deal," William replied, and Catherine could hear the smile in his voice. Outside their window, the lights of the modern world twinkled beyond the ancient walls of the castle. It was a view that perfectly captured their situation, rooted in history, but facing toward a future they would help to shape. The announcement had been made, the die cast. Now came the much harder task of proving that a 1,000-year-old institution could adapt itself to the needs of the 21st century while maintaining the values and traditions that gave it meaning. The whispers had become a declaration, and tomorrow the real work would begin. A helicopter descended through the Scottish mist toward the small community of Kilmartin Glen, where ancient stone circles shared the landscape with modern wind turbines, in a perfect metaphor for the balance between tradition and progress that Catherine and William were trying to achieve. As the aircraft touched down in a field that had been temporarily converted to a landing site, Catherine could see the crowd that had gathered: farmers, local business owners, children from the village school, and representatives from various organizations across the Highlands. This was their first major public engagement under their new titles, and the weight of expectation was palpable. Unlike previous royal visits where the protocol was well established and the outcomes largely ceremonial, today they would be making concrete commitments that would either validate their new approach or expose its limitations. "Remember," William said as they prepared to disembark, "we're not just visiting today, we're implementing." Catherine nodded, checking her notes one final time. They had 3 major announcements to make: the establishment of the Highland Innovation Hub, a partnership with agricultural universities to develop sustainable farming techniques, the Rural Connectivity Initiative, which would bring high-speed broadband to remote communities, and the Heritage Tourism Partnership, designed to create economic opportunities while preserving Scotland's cultural heritage. More importantly, they would be demonstrating their new authority by signing agreements and committing resources without the traditional delays for consultation and approval. It was exactly the kind of immediate, decisive action that their expanded role was designed to enable. The reception committee included the local member of parliament, the head of the regional council, and representatives from farming organizations. But Catherine's attention was drawn to the group of young people standing slightly apart from the official welcoming party. Teenagers who, according to her briefing notes, had organized their own community development project but lacked the resources to implement their ideas. "Your Royal Highnesses," the MP began with formal courtesy, "welcome to Kilmartin Glen. We're honored by your visit and excited about the initiatives you'll be announcing today." "The honor is ours," Catherine replied, but her eyes were still on the group of young people. "We're here to learn as much as to announce. Real change happens when communities drive their own development." The first stop was the local community center, where the Highland Innovation Hub would be headquartered. The building was a converted Victorian schoolhouse, its original architecture preserved but updated with modern facilities. Inside, displays had been set up showing local agricultural challenges and potential solutions that the new hub would help develop. Margaret MacLeod, a local farmer in her 60s, approached Catherine with the direct manner that characterized the region. "Your Royal Highness, I've been working this land for 40 years. I've seen good programs come and go, usually because they were designed by people in London who've never dealt with Scottish weather or Highland soil. How is this different?" It was exactly the kind of challenge Catherine had been expecting, and she appreciated Margaret's directness. "Because we're not designing this program for you, we're designing it with you. The hub will be run by local people, funded by the Crown Estate but managed by a board that includes farmers, researchers, and community leaders from the region." William stepped forward with a thick folder. "We have letters of commitment here from the University of Edinburgh, the Scottish Agricultural College, and 2 international research institutions. But more importantly, we have a commitment that no research will be undertaken without direct input from working farms." Margaret examined the documents with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read the fine print. After several minutes, she looked up with a slight smile. "This actually looks like it might work, but I'll believe it when I see results on my land." "Fair enough," Catherine replied. "What would convince you? Solve the drainage problem in my lower fields and find a way to extend my growing season by 3 weeks. Do that, and you'll have the support of every farmer in the Glen." William made notes while Catherine continued the conversation. This was precisely the kind of specific, practical challenge that the Innovation Hub was designed to address. More importantly, it was the kind of problem that required immediate attention rather than years of bureaucratic process. "Consider it done," Catherine said, and meant it. Under their new authority, she could commit hub resources to Margaret's specific challenges without seeking additional approval. "We'll have researchers here next week to assess your fields and begin developing solutions." Margaret's surprise was evident, but so was her growing interest. "Next week? Not next year after environmental impact studies and feasibility reports?" "Next week," William confirmed. "That's the whole point of how we're doing things differently now. The second announcement took place at the local primary school, where the Rural Connectivity Initiative would bring high-speed broadband to communities that had been left behind by commercial internet providers. The head teacher, James Morrison, had prepared a presentation showing how improved connectivity would transform educational opportunities for his students. "We have children here with remarkable potential," he explained to Catherine and William as they toured the school's computer lab, which contained outdated equipment that struggled with basic internet functions, but they're disadvantaged compared to their urban peers simply because of geography. The classrooms were filled with eager young faces, and Catherine found herself thinking of her own children at their well-equipped schools in Windsor. The disparity was striking, but it was also exactly the kind of inequality that their new resources were designed to address. "Show us what you need," William said to a group of older students who had prepared their own presentation about the connectivity challenges they faced. 14-year-old Isla McPherson stepped forward with confidence that impressed Catherine. "We've researched this extensively," Isla began, displaying charts and graphs that would have been creditable in a university setting. "Commercial providers say it's not economically viable to serve communities like ours, but we've calculated that, with proper infrastructure investment, we could not only serve local needs but also become a hub for the surrounding region." Catherine was intrigued. "What kind of infrastructure are you talking about?" "Fiber optic cables following existing utility corridors, solar power systems to ensure grid independence, and a community-owned maintenance cooperative." Another student, Hamish Grant, added, "We've identified funding sources and technical partners, but we need someone with authority to coordinate the implementation." William and Catherine exchanged glances. This was far more sophisticated than they had expected, and it demonstrated exactly the kind of local initiative that their new approach was designed to support. "What if we could provide not just the coordination, but the initial funding and technical expertise?" Catherine asked. "What would you be able to accomplish?" The excitement in the room was palpable as the students outlined their vision. Not just connectivity for their own community, but a model that could be replicated throughout the Highlands. They had contacted technical colleges about training programs, spoken with other rural communities about forming a regional network, and even researched export opportunities for their surplus capacity. "We want to be producers, not just consumers," Isla explained. "Why should rural communities always be on the receiving end of development? We have resources, we have skills, and we have ideas. We just need the infrastructure to implement them." Catherine felt a surge of excitement that had nothing to do with protocol or ceremony. This was exactly the kind of innovation and local leadership that could transform not just individual communities, but entire regions. More importantly, it was the kind of opportunity that their new authority allowed them to seize immediately. "Here's what we're going to do," she announced, surprising even William with her decisiveness. "We're going to fund your infrastructure proposal in full, but we're also going to establish a Highland Youth Development Fund that will provide ongoing support for initiatives like yours throughout the region." The room erupted in cheers, but Catherine wasn't finished. "And we want you to present your model to other Commonwealth countries during our upcoming tour. Rural connectivity is a global challenge, and solutions developed here could help communities from Canada to New Zealand." William stepped in to handle the practical details. "We'll need formal proposals within 2 weeks, community impact assessments, and coordination with local authorities. But I want to be clear. This is happening. You've done the research, you've identified the solutions, and we have the authority to implement them." The third announcement took place at the Kilmartin Museum, which housed an extraordinary collection of artifacts spanning 5,000 years of Highland history. Here they unveiled the Heritage Tourism Partnership, which would create economic opportunities while preserving the region's cultural heritage. Rachel Stewart, the museum's director, had prepared an ambitious presentation about the potential for heritage tourism to transform the local economy. "We're sitting on one of the most significant archaeological sites in Europe," she explained as they toured exhibits displaying Bronze Age pottery, medieval manuscripts, and traditional Highland crafts, but we've never had the resources to properly develop tourism infrastructure. Catherine studied the museum's visitor statistics, which showed steady growth but limited economic impact on the surrounding community. "What would change that?" she asked. "Accommodation, dining facilities, guided tour programs, and most importantly, training for local people to become heritage interpreters," Dr. Stewart replied. "Tourism only benefits communities when local people can participate in the industry rather than just watching visitors pass through. William was examining a display about traditional Highland crafts when he noticed elderly woman watching their conversation with keen interest. "I'm sorry," he said, approaching her. "I don't think we've been introduced." "Flora MacDonald," the woman replied with a slight curtsy. "Not the famous one, obviously, but a descendant. I've been making traditional Highland textiles for 60 years, learned from my grandmother who learned from hers." Catherine joined the conversation, immediately intrigued. "Are there others in the community with traditional craft skills?" "Oh, aye," Flora replied. "Weavers, potters, woodworkers, musicians. We've kept the traditions alive, but there's been no economic opportunity to share them with outsiders." An idea began forming in Catherine's mind. What if the Heritage Tourism Partnership included a traditional craft center? Not just displaying historical artifacts, but teaching living traditions. "Dr. Carson," Stuart's eyes lit up. "We could establish master craftsperson programs, apprenticeships for young people, and workshops for visitors. It would create jobs while preserving cultural knowledge." "And export opportunities," William added, his business background asserting itself. Traditional Highland crafts have a global market, particularly in Commonwealth countries with Scottish heritage populations. Flora MacDonald looked skeptical. "That sounds ambitious for a community this size." Catherine understood the skepticism rural communities had heard promises before. "What if we start small but think big? Establish the craft center here, train local instructors, and then replicate the model in other heritage sites across the Commonwealth. You could become the training hub for traditional crafts instruction throughout the network." The scope of what they were proposing was expanding beyond anything they had originally envisioned, but Catherine felt energized rather than overwhelmed. This was what their new authority was supposed to enable: the ability to see connections and opportunities, then act on them immediately rather than waiting for bureaucratic approval. As the formal presentations concluded, Catherine found herself in conversation with the group of teenagers who had approached their helicopter earlier. Led by 17-year-old Duncan MacLeod, no relation to Flora, he assured her with a grin, they had been working on their own community development project. "We want to establish a Highland Youth Parliament," Duncan explained. "Not just for this community, but for young people throughout the region. We've identified challenges that affect all rural youth: limited educational opportunities, economic migration to cities, loss of cultural traditions. But we've also identified solutions." Catherine was impressed by their organization and vision. What kind of solutions? Distance learning partnerships with universities, apprenticeship programs that combine traditional skills with modern technology, cultural exchange programs with other Commonwealth countries, Duncan outlined. "We want to create reasons for young people to stay in rural communities rather than leaving for the cities." "What do you need to make this happen?" William asked. "Funding, obviously, but also official recognition. We need adults to take us seriously, and we need institutional support to make our program sustainable." Catherine looked at William, seeing her own excitement reflected in his expression. "What if we made the Highland Youth Parliament an official advisory body to our Commonwealth Representative's office? You would have direct input into policies affecting rural youth throughout the Commonwealth." The teenager's response was immediate and enthusiastic. But Duncan had one more request. "Could we present our model to other Commonwealth countries during your tour? Rural youth face similar challenges everywhere, and solutions developed here might work elsewhere." "Consider it done," William replied immediately. "In fact, we'll establish youth parliament exchanges as a standard component of our Commonwealth visits." As the day drew to a close, Catherine felt exhausted but exhilarated. They had announced 3 major initiatives, committed millions in funding, and established partnerships that would create lasting change. More importantly, they had demonstrated that their new authority could enable exactly the kind of responsive, immediate action that rural communities needed. The helicopter ride back to Edinburgh provided time for reflection. Did we just commit to more than we can deliver? Catherine asked William as the Highland landscape passed below them. "Probably," William replied with a smile. "But that's what leadership requires sometimes. The willingness to reach beyond what you know you can accomplish." Catherine reviewed her notes from the day. They had committed to fund the Innovation Hub, the Connectivity Initiative, the Heritage Tourism Partnership, the Youth Development Fund, the Traditional Craft Center, and the Highland Youth Parliament. They had also promised to replicate successful models throughout the Commonwealth and establish youth exchange programs. "The press is going to have a field day with this," she observed. "Let them," William replied. "The question isn't whether we promise too much, it's whether we can deliver enough to make a real difference." That evening, back at Holyrood House Palace in Edinburgh, they held a debriefing session with their expanded staff. The day's announcements would require coordination with multiple government departments, international partners, and Commonwealth representatives. It was exactly the kind of complex, multifaceted initiative that their new authority was designed to enable. The Prime Minister's office is supportive but concerned about coordination with existing programs, their private secretary reported. The Scottish government is enthusiastic and wants to discuss expanding the initiatives to other regions. Catherine felt the satisfaction of work well done, but also the weight of new responsibilities. Set up meetings with both. We need to make sure our initiatives complement rather than duplicate existing programs. The Commonwealth Secretary-General's office has also called, the Secretary continued. They want to discuss incorporating today's initiatives into the broader Commonwealth development agenda. William nodded. Schedule that for next week. This is exactly the kind of Commonwealth-wide coordination that our new role is supposed to facilitate. As the briefing concluded and the staff departed, Catherine found herself thinking about the people they had met that day. Margaret MacLeod with her drainage problems, Isla Macpherson with her connectivity solutions, Flora MacDonald with her traditional crafts, Duncan MacLeod with his youth parliament vision. Each represented not just individual ambition, but community potential that had been waiting for the right kind of support. "Do you think we can really make all of this work?" she asked William as they prepared for bed. William considered the question seriously. "I think we have to try. The monarchy's future depends on proving that we can be more than just ceremonial figureheads. Today was our first chance to show that we can be effective agents of change." Catherine agreed, but she also understood that one successful day didn't constitute proof. They would need to deliver on every commitment they had made, overcome every obstacle they would inevitably encounter, and demonstrate sustained effectiveness over time. The real test wasn't the announcement, it was the implementation, and that work would begin tomorrow. But as she fell asleep that night, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in years of royal duty. The genuine excitement of meaningful work that could create lasting change. For the first time since accepting their new titles, she was confident they had made the right choice. Outside the palace windows, Edinburgh settled into its evening quiet. But somewhere in the Highlands, she knew, people were planning and dreaming with new possibilities. The first test had been passed, but the real work was just beginning. 6 months after their Scottish success, Catherine stood on the deck of HMS Edinburgh as it approached the harbor in Bridgetown, Barbados. The early morning Caribbean sun painted the water in shades of turquoise and gold, while the island itself emerged from the dawn mist like something from a postcard. But this wasn't a pleasure cruise. It was the beginning of the most ambitious royal tour in modern history. An 18-month journey through 37 Commonwealth nations that would test every aspect of their new authority and approach. William joined her at the ship's rail, holding 2 cups of coffee that had become their morning ritual during the ocean crossing from Gibraltar. The past week at sea had provided precious time for final preparations, away from the constant demands of palace life and media attention. Now, with Barbados rising before them, the theoretical was about to become intensely practical. "Ready for this?" William asked, though Catherine could hear the excitement beneath his calm exterior. "As ready as one can be for trying to revolutionize Commonwealth relations, one country at a time," she replied with a smile that mixed confidence and nervousness in equal measure. The tour they were undertaking was unprecedented in its scope and ambition. Unlike traditional royal visits, which followed established protocols of state dinners and ceremonial engagements, they would be implementing the community-centered approach they had developed in Scotland. Each stop would include the establishment of specific development initiatives, funded immediately from Crown resources, and designed to create lasting partnerships between Britain and the Commonwealth realms. Captain Sarah Morrison, the ship's commanding officer, approached with the morning briefing. "Your Royal Highnesses will be docking in 2 hours. The Barbadian Welcome Committee includes Prime Minister Thompson, Governor-General Mason, and representatives from the community organizations you'll be working with." Catherine reviewed her notes one final time. Barbados would be their first test of international implementation. They would be announcing the Caribbean Innovation Network, a program designed to connect universities, businesses, and community organizations across the region. They would also be launching the Climate Resilience Initiative, providing funding and expertise to help island communities adapt to rising sea levels and increasingly severe weather events. More significantly, they would be demonstrating a new model of Commonwealth engagement partnerships rather than charity, mutual benefit rather than one-way assistance, local leadership rather than external prescription. It was an approach that had emerged from months of consultation with Caribbean leaders, but would now face the test of practical implementation. The arrival in Bridgetown exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Thousands of people lined the waterfront, waving flags and holding signs welcoming them to the island. But Catherine's attention was drawn to a group of young people near the dock who had prepared their own presentation about climate change impacts on coastal communities. Their signs weren't just welcoming, they were challenging, calling for concrete action rather than symbolic gestures. Prime Minister Thompson greeted them with warmth but also directness that Catherine appreciated. "Your Royal Highnesses, welcome to Barbados. We're honored by your visit, but I hope you understand that our expectations are high. We've heard about your new approach, and we're eager to see what it means in practice." "Our expectations are equally high," Catherine replied. "We're not here to make promises we can't keep or to take credit for work done by others. We're here to be partners in development that benefits everyone involved." The first engagement was at the University of the West Indies, where they announced the Caribbean Innovation Network. The program would connect research institutions across the region, fund joint projects addressing shared challenges, and create exchange programs for students and faculty. But the real innovation was in the structure. Rather than being managed from London, the network would be governed by a council of Caribbean educators and community leaders. Dr. Angela Baptiste, the university's vice-chancellor, had been skeptical when first contacted about the program. "We've seen well-intentioned initiatives fail because they were designed without understanding local realities," she said during Catherine's campus tour. "How is this different?" Catherine gestured toward a group of students who had joined their discussion. "Because you're designing it. We're providing resources and connections, but the priorities, the methods, the measures of success, all of that comes from here." Michael Clark, a graduate student in marine biology, stepped forward with questions that demonstrated exactly the kind of local expertise the program was designed to leverage. "The climate challenges we face here are similar to what they're experiencing in Pacific Island nations," he said. "Could this network facilitate collaboration with universities in Fiji, Tonga, and other island states?" William was intrigued. "What kind of collaboration are you thinking about?" "Research partnerships on coral reef restoration, data sharing about sea level rise impacts, joint development of renewable energy technologies adapted for island environments," Michael outlined. "The challenges are global, but the solutions need to be locally appropriate." Catherine saw immediately how this could work. "What if we expanded the Caribbean Innovation Network to include Pacific partners, create an interregional island nations research collaborative?" Dr. Baptiste's skepticism was visibly shifting to excitement. That could create the critical mass needed for meaningful research impact. Small island states individually don't have the resources for major climate research, but collectively, you could lead global research on island climate adaptation, William finished, and develop solutions that could be implemented throughout the Commonwealth. The expansion of scope was exactly what their new authority was designed to enable. Rather than limiting themselves to predetermined programs, they could respond to opportunities and connections as they emerged. Within hours, they were coordinating with Commonwealth representatives in the Pacific to establish the expanded network. The second day took them to coastal communities directly affected by climate change. The village of Oistins, traditionally a fishing community, had seen its harbor damaged by recent storms, and its fishing grounds affected by coral bleaching. Local leader Jennifer Blackman had organized the community to present their own solutions rather than waiting for external assistance. "We know what we need," Jennifer explained as she led Catherine and William through the village. "Improved harbor defenses, coral restoration programs, and alternative economic opportunities that don't depend entirely on fishing. What we haven't had is access to the resources and expertise to implement our plans." Catherine was impressed by the community's preparation and organization. They had detailed plans, cost estimates, environmental impact assessments, and timelines for implementation. More importantly, they had consensus among community members about priorities and methods. "Show us your plans," William said, and Jennifer led them to the community center where detailed proposals were displayed. The Harbor Defense Project involved innovative use of natural materials to create barriers that would protect against storm surge while enhancing marine habitat. The Coral Restoration Program combined traditional knowledge from older fishermen with cutting-edge scientific techniques. The alternative economic opportunities focused on sustainable tourism and artisan crafts that could provide income during fishing off-seasons. "How much funding are we talking about?" Catherine asked. "Initial phase, about $2 million Eastern Caribbean dollars," Jennifer replied. "That's roughly £500,000. But the real value comes from the expertise and connections you can provide. University researchers, international markets for our crafts, tourism networks that can bring visitors here responsibly." Catherine looked at William, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his expression. This was exactly the kind of comprehensive, community-driven development that their approach was designed to support. More importantly, it was the kind of project that could serve as a model for other coastal communities throughout the Caribbean and beyond. "Consider it funded," she said. "But let's think bigger. What if we made Oistins a demonstration site for coastal community resilience? Bring researchers here to document your approaches. Invite community leaders from other island nations to learn from your experience. Establish this as a training center for climate adaptation techniques." The excitement in the room was palpable, but Jennifer had learned to be cautious about promises from outsiders. "That sounds wonderful in theory, but how do we know this won't become another project that takes control away from the community?" William stepped forward with documents they had prepared. "Because the community retains ownership and control of everything we're proposing. The Crown provides funding and connections. But all decisions about implementation remain with you, and we're prepared to put that commitment in writing, with legal guarantees." Jennifer examined the documents carefully, conferring with other community leaders in rapid conversations that mixed English with local dialect. After 20 minutes of intense discussion, she turned back to Catherine and William with a cautious smile. "All right," she said. "Let's try this partnership approach and see if it works better than the usual aid model." The third day brought them to secondary schools across the island, where they announced the Youth Leadership Exchange Program. Unlike traditional educational exchanges that benefited only a small elite, this program would create ongoing connections between schools throughout the Commonwealth, with regular student and teacher exchanges, joint projects, and shared resources. At Harrison College in Bridgetown, they met 15-year-old Marcus Phillips, who had prepared a presentation about youth perspectives on Commonwealth development. "Most programs for young people are designed by adults who assume they know what we need," Marcus said with a directness that reminded Catherine of the Scottish students they had met in Kilmartin Glen. "But we have our own ideas about how to solve problems." Catherine was intrigued. What kind of ideas? Climate adaptation strategies that incorporate traditional knowledge with modern technology. Economic development models that prioritize sustainability over short-term profit. Educational approaches that prepare us for jobs that don't exist yet, Marcus outlined. "We're not just the future. We're the present, but we need resources and connections to implement our ideas." William saw immediately how this connected to their broader approach. What if the Youth Leadership Exchange included a Commonwealth Youth Innovation Fund? Young people could apply for funding to implement projects that address shared challenges across multiple countries. Marcus's excitement was infectious. So a solar energy project developed here in Barbados could be adapted and implemented in Jamaica or Belize or Ghana, and students would be involved in both the development and the implementation? Exactly, Catherine confirmed. And the most successful projects would be scaled up for implementation throughout the Commonwealth, with the young innovators leading the expansion. The program they outlined would create networks of young leaders throughout the Commonwealth, provide them with resources to implement their ideas, and establish mentorship connections with universities, businesses, and government organizations. But most importantly, it would give young people real authority over programs affecting their lives, rather than simply consulting them about decisions made by others. As the Barbados visit concluded, Catherine felt the exhilaration of successful innovation combined with the weight of expanding commitments. They had established 3 major new programs, committed substantial funding, and created partnerships that would require ongoing coordination and support. More importantly, they had demonstrated that their community-centered approach could work in an international context. The evening reception at Government House provided an opportunity to hear feedback from Barbadian leaders about their new approach. Prime Minister Thompson was generous in her assessment, but also clear about expectations. "What you've demonstrated here has the potential to transform Commonwealth relationships," she said during her remarks to the gathered guests. "But transformation requires sustained commitment, not just initial enthusiasm. We'll be watching to see whether these partnerships develop into the mutual benefits you've promised." Catherine appreciated the directness. "We hope you'll do more than watch. We hope you'll hold us accountable for everything we've committed to, and let us know immediately if we're not living up to our promises." Governor General Mason, who had observed the week's activities with the perspective of someone who had seen many royal visits over the years, offered her own assessment. "What's different about this visit is that you've listened more than you've talked, learned more than you've taught, and committed to ongoing relationships rather than one-time gestures. If you can maintain that approach throughout your tour, you'll accomplish something genuinely historic." As HMS Edinburgh prepared to depart for their next stop in Jamaica, Catherine found herself reviewing the week's commitments and planning for their implementation. Each program they had established would require ongoing oversight, regular assessment, and adaptation based on results. More importantly, each partnership they had created carried the responsibility of proving that their new approach could deliver lasting benefits. "How are we going to manage all of this?" William asked as they watched Barbados disappear beyond the horizon. "The same way we managed Scotland," Catherine replied. "One community at a time, one partnership at a time, one commitment at a time. And by trusting the people we're working with to tell us when we're getting it right and when we're getting it wrong." The Caribbean leg of their tour would continue for 3 more weeks, with stops in Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, St. Lucia, Grenada, and Belize. Each country would present new challenges and opportunities, requiring them to adapt their approach while maintaining consistency in their commitment to community-centered development. But as Catherine prepared for the next phase of their journey, she felt confident that they had found a model that could work. The key was remaining flexible enough to respond to local needs while maintaining focus on the fundamental principles of partnership, sustainability, and local leadership that had guided their approach from the beginning. The Commonwealth journey was far from over, but they had proven to themselves and to others that their new authority could be used effectively to create meaningful change. Now came the even greater challenge of sustaining that effectiveness across dozens of countries and hundreds of communities, each with its own history, culture, and development priorities. The sun set over the Caribbean as HMS Edinburgh sailed toward Jamaica, carrying them toward the next test of their evolving approach to royal service and Commonwealth partnership. 18 months later, Catherine stood in the same yellow drawing room at Buckingham Palace where their journey had begun, but the space felt transformed by everything that had happened since. The walls that had once seemed to represent centuries of unchanged tradition now felt like witnesses to evolution, bearing silent testimony to the profound changes that had reshaped the monarchy during their Commonwealth tour. William entered carrying the final report from their tour coordinators, a document that would become the foundation for the next phase of their work. The numbers were staggering. 37 countries visited, 412 community partnerships established, over £200 million committed to development initiatives, and perhaps most importantly, a fundamental shift in how the Commonwealth nations viewed their relationship with the Crown. "Listen to this," William said, reading from a letter that had arrived that morning from Isla Macpherson, the Scottish teenager whose connectivity project had been one of their first successes. "The Highland Youth Parliament has established partnerships with youth organizations in 23 Commonwealth countries. We're not just connected to each other now, we're connected to young people everywhere who are working on similar challenges." Catherine smiled, remembering the determined young woman who had presented her internet infrastructure proposal in that small Highland school. Isla's project had indeed become a model, replicated in rural communities from Canada to New Zealand, but adapted to local needs and circumstances in ways that demonstrated the power of their partnership approach. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. 3 initiatives had failed completely, requiring painful decisions about cutting funding and redirecting resources. Two countries had initially rejected their partnership model, preferring traditional aid relationships, before eventually agreeing to try the collaborative approach. Media criticism had been intense at times, particularly when early projects struggled with implementation difficulties. But the successes had far outweighed the failures. The Caribbean Innovation Network had facilitated breakthrough research on coral reef restoration that was being implemented globally. The African Agricultural Innovation Initiative had increased crop yields by an average of 30% across participating communities. The Pacific Island Climate Resilience Program had become a model for other small island states worldwide. More importantly, they had proven that the monarchy could be a force for positive change rather than simply a symbol of historical continuity. The Commonwealth relationships they had built were based on mutual benefit and shared purpose, rather than historical obligation and ceremonial courtesy. King Charles entered the room with the energy that had characterized his approach to the monarchy since his coronation. At 76, he moved with purpose and obvious satisfaction at what his son and daughter-in-law had accomplished. Behind him came Princess Anne, Prince Edward, and other senior royals who had gathered to hear the final assessment of the tour's impact. "Before we begin the formal briefing," Charles said, settling into his preferred chair near the windows, "I want to say how proud I am of what you've both accomplished. You've not only met the goals we set for this tour, you've exceeded them in ways that have transformed our understanding of what the monarchy can achieve." Catherine felt a flush of pride, but also the weight of new expectations. The success of their Commonwealth initiative had created momentum for even more ambitious projects. They were already planning a second tour that would include non-Commonwealth countries, exploring whether their partnership model could be adapted for relationships with nations that had no historical connection to the crown. Helen Morrison, their press secretary, presented the media analysis first. "Public approval ratings for the monarchy have reached their highest levels in 50 years, she reported. But more significantly, approval ratings among young people, traditionally our most skeptical demographic, have increased by over 60%. The numbers were impressive, but Catherine was more interested in the qualitative feedback from the communities they had worked with. Letters, emails, and social media posts from their partner organizations painted a picture of genuine transformation rather than superficial publicity success. "Read the one from Marcus Phillips," William suggested, referring to the young Barbadian leader who had challenged them about youth involvement in development programs. Helen found the letter in her file. "Your Royal Highnesses, the Commonwealth Youth Innovation Fund has changed everything for young people here. We're not just consulted about programs affecting us, we're designing and implementing them. More importantly, we're connected to young leaders throughout the Commonwealth who are working on similar challenges. You didn't just give us resources, you gave us a voice and a network." The Youth Innovation Fund had indeed become one of their most successful initiatives, generating over 300 projects across the Commonwealth and establishing permanent connections between young leaders in different countries. Several of the funded projects had become self-sustaining enterprises, creating economic opportunities while addressing social challenges. Ambassador Patricia Reynolds, representing the Commonwealth Secretary General, provided the international perspective. "The transformation in Commonwealth relationships has been remarkable," she reported. "We've moved from a model of symbolic association to one of practical cooperation. Member nations are actively seeking collaboration with each other through the networks you've established." The economic impact analysis was equally impressive. Dr. James Fletcher from the London School of Economics had studied the tour's financial effects and found that every pound invested by the Crown had generated an average of £4 in additional economic activity within partner communities. "But the real value isn't in the immediate economic returns," Fletcher explained. "It's in the capacity building, the network effects, and the demonstration that alternative development models can succeed. You've created a template that other institutions could adapt for their own development work." Catherine was particularly proud of the capacity-building results. Rather than creating dependence on royal funding, their programs had consistently focused on training local leaders, establishing sustainable institutions, and creating networks that could function independently. The measure of their success wasn't how much control they retained, but how quickly their partners could operate without them. "The sustainability metrics are what really tell the story," William noted, reviewing another section of the analysis. 87% of our initiatives are now locally managed. 73% have secured funding beyond our initial commitments. and 61% have expanded beyond their original scope. Princess Anne, with her characteristic directness, asked the question Catherine had been expecting. What's the long-term plan? You can't maintain this level of travel and commitment indefinitely, and you can't expand indefinitely without losing focus. It was a crucial question that had occupied much of their planning over recent months. The success of their approach had created demand that exceeded their capacity to respond personally. They needed to find ways to scale their impact without losing the personal connection that had made their partnerships effective. We're transitioning to a hub model, Catherine explained, outlining the strategy they had developed. Rather than trying to manage everything directly from London, we're establishing regional coordination centers in the Caribbean, Pacific, Africa, and Asia. Each hub will be locally managed but connected to our resources and networks. William continued the explanation. We'll maintain direct involvement in strategic planning and major initiatives, but day-to-day operations will be managed by people who understand local contexts better than we ever could. Our role becomes facilitation rather than implementation. The hub model had emerged from their recognition that sustainable impact required local leadership rather than external management. By establishing strong institutions and networks, they could multiply their effectiveness while ensuring that their initiatives remained responsive to community needs. Edward raised practical concerns about financial sustainability. The Crown estate revenues that have funded this expansion are substantial, but they're not unlimited. How do you maintain funding for an ever-growing network of commitments? Catherine had anticipated this question as well. We're moving toward a partnership funding model. Rather than relying entirely on Crown resources, we're leveraging our networks to bring together multiple funding sources for each initiative. Government development agencies, private foundations, corporate social responsibility programs, international organizations, they all want to be part of successful development models. The financial strategy reflected their broader philosophy of partnership over charity. By demonstrating effectiveness in creating networks of successful practitioners, they had attracted interest from numerous organizations seeking to support proven approaches to development challenges. As the formal briefing concluded, Catherine found herself thinking about the children, who had grown and changed during the 18 months of travel and intense focus on their new roles. George, now 13, had developed a sophisticated understanding of global development challenges and often surprised them with insights about the connections between their various initiatives. Charlotte, 11, had become fascinated by the cultural diversity of the Commonwealth and was learning her fourth language. Louis, 7, simply accepted that helping people around the world was what his parents did for work. How has this affected the children? Charles asked, as if reading Catherine's thoughts. They've seen the world differently than any royal children before them, William replied thoughtfully. They understand that their future roles will be about service in very practical, immediate ways, but they've also maintained the normal childhood experiences that we've worked so hard to provide. The balance between royal duty and family life had indeed been challenging during the tour, but it had also provided the children with experiences and perspectives that would shape their understanding of their future responsibilities. They had seen their parents working to solve real problems, building genuine relationships with people from every walk of life, and using royal resources to create lasting change. As the meeting dispersed and the family members departed for their various commitments, Catherine found herself alone with William in the room where their transformation had begun. The late afternoon light streaming through the tall windows reminded her of that morning months ago when they had first discussed accepting their expanded authority. "Do you remember what you asked me that first morning?" Catherine said. "Whether I was really ready for this?" William smiled, settling beside her on the window seat that had witnessed so many of their important conversations. "I remember. What's your answer now?" Catherine considered the question seriously. The past 18 months had been the most challenging and rewarding of their lives. They had succeeded beyond